So I hope you all don't mind that I took a little bit of a break last week. I think it's really important that we make space for Black voices right now because we need to listen and we need to learn. But today I am back at it with some more spicy connections between racism and climate change, because there is so much interconnection between the ways in which people of color have been exploited and the environment has been exploited, and we need to talk about that. So today I want to explain the ecosystem services approach to environmentalism. Some environmentalists argue that we should define monetary values for the things ecosystems do for us, because that way we'll be motivated to protect them. For example, bees provide pollination. So what you can do is compare the profits of a farmer without and then with bees to determine the monetary value of the pollination service. Another example is wetlands. Since they are great for flood control, you can predict the cost of damages due to a flood to determine the monetary value of a wetland. Now, there's a lot of problems with this approach, and I'm just going to touch on a few of the main ones. But first of all, there are about a zillion different ways to define value, and not all of them are easy to quantify. There are things that we value very directly via consumption that are pretty easy to quantify. For example, when we eat anything, basically, plant or animal. But then there's also non-consumptive values like recreation, bird watching, surfing, hiking, and then there's also indirect values. For example, we don't eat plankton, but the fish that we eat the plankton. So is the plankton included in quantifying the value of the fish? And then there is the intrinsic value of a thing, which you can measure by surveying people about how much they value the sheer existence of an ecosystem or a part of an ecosystem. The problem with that being that people vary wildly in how they value the same thing depending on education and proximity and so many other different factors. Almost nobody is going to end up being happy with what you determine the average value of the thing is. It's also really difficult to predict how much something will be valued in the future. For example, right now, a wetland might not be protecting much from flooding, but maybe in a couple decades, there'll be a pretty significant population there, and there's no way for us to anticipate those kinds of things. But many argue that intrinsic value is, by definition, infinite, and there can be no price placed on a human life or any other life or any ecosystem. They argue that any other way one might try to determine the economic value of an ecosystem is anthropocentric, meaning it selfishly focuses on the needs and desires of humans and ignores the intrinsic value of a thing as it exists. So that's the first issue. It's really difficult to define the value, and even if we could, it may not be moral. Second, the ecosystem services approach to valuing natural capital is really an attempt to reconcile capitalism and consumerism with environmentalism. It says we don't actually care about the environment, we care about money. It makes environmentalism an economic problem and doesn't get people thinking about valuing the environment for its own sake or thinking very long term. For example, if you pay landowners not to damage the environment, they then expect a reward for refraining from bad behavior. The implicit message being sent there is that they should be entitled to exploit the environment, but we're artificially creating monetary incentives not to. Instead, shouldn't we all just be expected to do the right thing and then punished if we don't, just like in any other situation? You don't pay people to not murder, you just expect them to not murder and then punish them if they do. Ultimately, the ecosystem services approach attaches explicit dollar values to things, which provides a rational basis for exploiting them. Say we've devised some insanely complicated system of valuing nature that is perfect and works in every way and there's nothing wrong with it. And then say you decide a wetland is valued at $5 million. But someone says they can build a factory of some kind on that land and make $6 million. By the logic of ecosystem services, that factory should be built. So all you've really done in putting a price tag on that wetland is created a way to justify exploiting it instead of a way to justify protecting it. What it comes down to is the human versus nature divide I've talked about a lot before. The longer we continue to see ourselves as separate from the environment or as superior to it, the harder it will be to reverse the damage. But the good news is there is historical precedent for this kind of perspective shift. For thousands of years, people had no problem placing a dollar value on another human life. Slavery was a widely accepted practice in many different societies across time and space. But finally, with the end of the Atlantic slave trade, it became widely accepted that this was morally wrong, that each human life has equal and intrinsic value. And here we are, hundreds of years after the end of slavery, massive asterisk, still grappling with systemic racism that exploits BIPOC. No one ever said it was going to be easy. But I think something important to note is that for centuries, people of color have been compared to animals, called savages and monsters and monkeys as a means to degrade them. They were found in the wild, which is by definition uncivilized. But if we learn to respect the environment as equally as valuable as humans, and we treat the well-being of plants, animals, and ecosystems as equally important as our own well-being, colonizers created this narrative where nature and people of color are lesser than to justify their exploitation. But what if being called an animal wasn't an insult? Because first of all, it's true, humans are animals, mammals in fact, and to be recognized as such is to recognize that we are just one part of a massive ecosystem, the delicate design and balance of which we have only begun to scratch at the surface of understanding. An ecosystem so complex and interconnected that we may never understand every single little piece. And to be recognized as part of such a beautiful and wonderful and incredible thing is to recognize that our needs are no more important than any other piece of that beautiful thing, because we all depend on each other. Reimagining nature and our relationship with it is also about reimagining ourselves and our relationship to each other, and it can bring greater respect and empathy. The issues of climate change and racism are so deeply interconnected in their origins, but over the years they have become thought of as separate things, separate issues. But if we want to address the challenges, we need to address the root causes, and the root causes are one and the same: white supremacy. White supremacy over nature and white supremacy over people of color. As always, I'm going to put some resources in the description. Like this video if you learned something. Leave a comment below if you have any questions or feedback. And subscribe. Okay, I'm sweating, so bye.